Welcome to your deep dive. Today, we're going to be exploring land use and environmental protection in Kelowna. You've given us a pretty diverse set of materials, actually. Legal arguments uh, about a property at 4355 Jaud Road. We've got sections of Kelowna's official community plan and even their 2024 Sustainable Urban Forest Strategy. So think of us as your guides through all this information.
Yeah, we're going to be looking at how Kelowna tries to balance, development with preserving the environment. We're going to look at how these policies actually play out in real life.
Exactly. And maybe even uncover some of those aha moments, the ones that make you go, wait a minute, that doesn't seem quite right.
That's the fun part.
Yeah.
So let's jump right in. Let's start with this 4355 Jaud Road. It sounds like this property sparked some serious debate. What happened there?
Well, it's a story that starts pretty simply. A piece of land, it was originally designated for agricultural use, like a lot of the surrounding area. But then it was rezoned. It got rezoned to allow for mobile homes and camping.
Okay.
And that's where things get a little sticky.
Interesting. And I guess it's interesting because of where this property is. It's outside of the city's permanent growth boundary. So that means the official community plan, the OCP, designates this area for rural and agricultural use. So to rezone it for mobile homes, that seems to clash with the city's long-term vision for the area.
It does.
Yeah.
And that's not all. The legal arguments book you provided, it really digs into these inconsistencies surrounding this rezoning.
Yeah.
They argue that it happened without proper public consultation or even adequate notice to existing residents.
Yeah, that lack of transparency is a big concern. It raises all kinds of questions about fairness and whether residents' voices are actually being heard in the decision-making process.
For sure. And it's not just about the process. There are serious environmental concerns here, too.
Yeah.
The book highlights the removal of hundreds of trees, including, and this is interesting, vegetation within these designated ecologically sensitive areas.
And that's where those aha moments come in, right? Kelowna's OCP really emphasizes this environmental protection, but then in this instance, trees were removed from these protected areas. And the legal argument suggests that a key factor was the absence of something called a Section 219 covenant on the property.
Now, for those of us who aren't, land use experts, what is a Section 219 covenant and why is it so important in this case?
It's basically a legal tool that's used to protect environmentally sensitive areas. You can kind of think of it as like a binding agreement that limits what can be done on a property to really safeguard its ecological value. And neighboring properties, they had these covenants. 4355 Jaud Road did not.
So because this property didn't have a covenant, they could clear the trees without the same level of scrutiny.
It seems that way. The legal argument book makes a pretty strong case that this lack of a covenant, it allowed for this kind of unregulated clearing of trees, which led to habitat destruction.
So it does raise a crucial question. If Kelowna's really committed to protecting the environment, why wasn't this covenant in place?
That's the question, isn't it? It seems like there's a disconnect between the city's stated policies and the actual actions taken.
Definitely. So how do we make sense of this apparent disconnect? Let's take a closer look at the broader context.
Yeah.
You gave us some sections of Kelowna's official community plan, and those developed with CARE 2014 guidelines. Do you think these documents can help us understand what happened at 4355 Jaud Road?
I think so. I think what's fascinating is these documents really lay out a framework for responsible development. But as we're seeing, the 4355 Jaud Road case highlights some potential, gaps or inconsistencies in how that framework is applied in reality.
Yeah. Can you give us a specific example?
Well, the OCP has a policy 16.1.1 that clearly states that any land use changes have to align with the OCP's vision. And the vision for this area around 4355 Jaud Road is to preserve it as rural and agricultural. So rezoning it for mobile homes, it kind of seems to go against that vision, doesn't it?
It does seem to contradict it, yeah. And the legal arguments book, it points to other potential inconsistencies as well, right?
Yeah, they claim that the residents weren't adequately consulted about this rezoning, which could potentially be a violation of Section 475 of the Local Government Act. And that section basically outlines the obligation for public consultation for these kinds of decisions.
So not only does the rezoning seem inconsistent with the OCP's vision, but the process itself may have been flawed.
Yeah.
What else stands out to you?
Well, there are also specific OCP policies, and these are 10.2.6 and 10.2.8, and these emphasize using covenants to protect sensitive areas, especially those, along creeks and rivers, riparian zones. But 4355 Jaud Road, even though there was a creek running through it, it didn't have that protection.
Okay, so again, we're kind of seeing this pattern. Policies that aim to protect the environment, but the actions don't seem to follow through.
Right.
And these inconsistencies aren't limited to the OCP, are they? The Develop with Care 2014 guidelines, they also seem to paint a different picture than what we're seeing on the ground at 4355 Jaud Rd.
You're right. The Develop with Care guidelines, they emphasize protecting species at risk. But according to the legal argument book, this development, it impacted what they call red-listed ecosystems, which are ecosystems that are considered extremely vulnerable.
So this is more than just some missing paperwork or procedural errors. This is about potentially violating policies that are designed to protect species at risk and their habitats.
Exactly. And it raises questions about how these decisions are being made, who's really benefiting, and who bears the cost when these policies aren't followed.
Really important questions. Now, before we move on, I want to kind of circle back to something we talked about earlier. You mentioned that this urban forest strategy, highlights some of the same challenges that were evident in this 4355 Jaud Rd case.
Hmm.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit? What are some of those shared challenges, and how does this strategy aim to address them?
Well, one of the biggest challenges is just development pressure.
Yeah.
As Kelowna grows, there's increasing demand for land, and that often puts pressure on these green spaces. And the strategy recognizes this, and it talks about the need for a more balanced approach to development, one that really recognizes the value of trees and green spaces.
So it's not about saying no to development. It's about finding ways to integrate it with protecting the natural assets that we have.
Exactly. And the strategy offers some specific ideas for how to do this. For example, they talk about working with developers to incorporate what they call green infrastructure into new projects.
Okay, green infrastructure, what does that mean?
Think about things like bioswales, rain gardens, and permeable pavements.
Okay.
These types of features, they can help manage stormwater runoff, which is a big issue in urban areas, and they also create space for trees and vegetation.
So it's not an either, it's about doing development in a way that's sensitive to the environment and maybe even enhances the ecosystem.
Exactly. And the urban forest strategy provides a glimpse of what that could look like in Kelowna. A city where trees and green spaces aren't just an afterthought, they're actually integrated into the very fabric of the city.
I like that. That's a great vision. But I imagine it's going to take a pretty big shift in mindset to achieve this.
Yeah, it will. It requires moving away from that old way of thinking where, development and the environment are at odds with each other.
Right, right.
And kind of embracing this new perspective where we see them as interconnected and interdependent. A healthy environment, it contributes to a healthy economy and a vibrant community.
For sure. And the urban forest strategy is definitely a step in the right direction.
Yeah.
But to really understand where Kelowna is headed, we need to revisit the official community plan.
Okay.
Earlier, we talked about some of those inconsistencies, between the OCP's stated goals and what actually happened at 4355 Jaud Rd. But, looking beyond that case, what does the OCP tell us about Kelowna's vision for the future?
Well, the OCP covers a really wide range of planning issues from, transportation to housing to economic development. But throughout the document, there's this clear recognition of the importance of environmental protection and this balanced approach to development.
Can you give me an example?
Yeah, for example, the OCP includes specific policies that are aimed at protecting environmentally sensitive areas, things like riparian zones, wetlands, wildlife corridors.
So it's not just about protecting individual trees, it's about protecting entire ecosystems.
Right. And the OTP also promotes using green infrastructure and low-impact development practices, just like we saw in the urban forest strategy.
So it sounds like those two documents are kind of working together, reinforcing each other.
Yeah, that's the idea. They're setting a direction, a vision for what Kelowna can be.
They're providing that roadmap. But as we've seen with 4355 Jaud Rd, having the right policies, it's only part of the equation, isn't it? It's about how they're implemented, enforced, and, ultimately, how they translate into real outcomes.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The 4355 Jaud Rd case, it's a really powerful reminder that accountability and transparency are essential. It's not enough to have good intentions. We have to make sure that those intentions translate into actions that protect both the environment and the community's interests.
So what can, everyday people do to make sure that happens? How can they hold their elected officials accountable and make sure these policies are implemented properly?
That's a great question, and one we're going to be exploring further as we continue this deep dive. But for now, I'll leave you with this thought. Stay informed, get involved, and make your voice heard. The future of Kelowna really depends on it. The strategy emphasizes community involvement, They really want residents to take ownership of their urban forest, not just see it as something the city manages.
I like that idea. But how are they going to get people involved?
Well, they talk about expanding programs like Neighborhoods, which encourages people to plant trees on their properties, and they also want to educate the public about the benefits of trees. They're partnering with organizations like the Okanagan Collaborative Conservation Program.
So it's about collaboration and empowering residents to be part of the solution?
Yeah.
It's very different from what we saw with 4335 Jaud Road.
It is a different approach, and it's encouraging. But let's not forget about 4355 Jaud Road. It's a reminder that even with good policies, things can go wrong.
It's a cautionary tale, for sure. And it highlights the need for accountability, transparency, and making sure those policies are actually enforced.
You're right. It also shows that we need ongoing dialogue between the city and residents. Development decisions should reflect the whole community's values, not just what developers want.
Agreed. Now, before we move on, I want to go back to something you said earlier. You mentioned that urban forest strategy highlights some of the same challenges that were evident in the 4335 Jaud Road case.
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain that a bit? What are those shared challenges, and how does this strategy address them?
Well, development pressure is a big one. As Kelowna grows, there's more and more demand for land, which often puts pressure on green spaces. The strategy acknowledges this and suggests we need a more balanced approach to development, one that considers the value of trees and green spaces.
So, not stopping development, but finding ways to make it work with protecting our natural assets.
Exactly. And they offer some specific ideas. For instance, they want to work with developers to add green infrastructure to new projects.
Green infrastructure, what's that?
Think bioswales, rain gardens, permeable pavements, those kinds of things.
Okay.
They help manage stormwater runoff, which is a huge problem in cities, and they create space for trees and plants.
So it's not either development or the environment. It could be both.
Precisely. The urban forest strategy gives us a peek at what that might look like in Kelowna, a city where trees and green spaces are part of the city's design.
I like that vision.
Yeah.
But I imagine it'll take a change in how we think about these things.
It will. We need to move away from the old way of thinking where development and the environment are enemies and embrace a new perspective where we see them as connected. A healthy environment makes a healthy economy and a vibrant community.
Well said. And the urban forest strategy is moving in that direction.
Yeah.
But to really get where Kelowna's going, we need to look at the official community plan again.
Okay.
We talked about some inconsistencies between what the OCP says and what happened at 4355 Jaud Road. But what does the OCP tell us about Kelowna's vision for the future in general?
The OCP covers a lot of planning issues, but it's clear that they see environmental protection and balanced development as important.
Can you give me an example?
Sure. The OCP has policies about protecting environmentally sensitive areas, things like riparian zones, wetlands, and wildlife corridors.
So it's not just about each tree, it's about the whole ecosystem.
Exactly. And the OCP also supports using green infrastructure and low-impact development, just like the urban forest strategy.
So the OCP and the urban forest strategy are working together toward a more sustainable future for Kelowna.
That's right. They provide the framework for making decisions that put the long-term health of the community and the environment first.
It's good to see this focus on sustainability in Kelowna's plans. But like we said before, there can be a gap between plans and actions. What can people do to close that gap and make sure these plans create real change?
That's the big question, and it's one we should all be thinking about. I think the first thing is to stay informed. Read the documents, go to council meetings, understand the issues.
Knowledge is power. And once you know what's going on, you can get involved.
Exactly. Join community groups, volunteer, and speak up. Let your elected officials know that you care about the environment and you want them to make sustainability a priority.
It's about being an active citizen and making sure our leaders do what they're supposed to.
Well put. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by the challenges, but remember, every little thing we do makes a difference.
This deep dive has been really eye-opening. We've explored complex policies, uncovered inconsistencies, and talked about big questions about growth, sustainability, and Kelowna's future.
But I think it's given me a sense of hope.
Hope, because Kelowna is taking steps in the right direction with their planning and their commitment to the urban forest.
And hope because people are engaged and they care about shaping their city's future.
This has been a great conversation. Thank you for guiding us through this deep dive.
My pleasure. Remember, the future of Kelowna isn't set in stone. It's something we create together.
So let's get informed, get involved, and make our voices heard. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep. So we've spent a good amount of time now looking at how Kelowna is approaching this balance between development and protecting the environment. And I think we found some pretty interesting things.
Yeah, definitely. We started with that 4355 Jaud Road case, which kind of brought to light some potential problems between what the policies say and what's actually happening.
Yeah, for sure. And then we took a look at the official community plan, that OCP, and the sustainable urban forest strategy, trying to figure out how Kelowna is going to tackle these challenges of growth and, keeping things sustainable.
Exactly. And now, in this final part of our deep dive, I want to kind of shift our focus to the future a little bit.
Ooh, I like that. The future. So what kind of future is Kelowna picturing for itself? And how do these plans shape that vision?
Well, let's start with the sustainable urban forest strategy. It's got a lot of, goals and specific actions in it, but what do you think the overall message is?
I think for me, it paints a picture of Kelowna really valuing their trees and green spaces, not just as like decorations, but as something vital to a healthy city.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. It's not just about sticking trees here and there. It's about making green infrastructure a core part of the city.
That's a cool phrase, integrating green infrastructure. Can you tell me a bit more what that actually means, like in real life?
Sure. So it's about moving away from the old idea that you have separate green spaces, just parks and natural areas, and instead thinking about how trees and plants can be part of streets, neighborhoods, even businesses.
Bringing nature right into the city.
Yeah, exactly. And the strategy talks about all the benefits that come with that. Trees help cool down cities, they help with stormwater, air quality, they provide habitat for animals. It's good for everyone.
Sounds great. But, like we saw with 4355 Jaud Road, putting those policies into practice can be tough. The strategy even admits that growth and urbanization make it hard to protect green spaces.
It does. So, how do they suggest balancing those pressures? How do they protect green spaces while the city keeps growing?
That's a good question.
Well, they talk about a bunch of things: strengthening the policies, putting money into green infrastructure, getting the community involved, and coming up with new ideas.
Can you give me an example of what that might actually look like?
One thing they talk about is making a 10-year plan for planting trees in the city. But it's not just planting randomly, it's focusing on places that don't have a lot of tree cover, especially in neighborhoods that haven't had much access to green spaces in the past.
So it's about fairness, too. Making sure everyone in Kelowna benefits from the urban forest.
Exactly, and they're being smart about it too. It's not just any tree, it's about picking the right types for the right places, thinking about climate change and all that.
Yeah, making sure the trees they plant now will still be healthy in the future. What else stood out to you?
They really stress protecting the trees that are already there, especially the big old ones. Those are the most valuable, right?
Yeah, that connects back to 4355 Jaud Road,
Yeah.
where people were upset about those mature trees being taken down.
It does. It shows how important it is to find that balance, protecting existing trees while also adding new ones.
Finding that sweet spot. Is that idea of balance in other parts of the strategy, too?
Oh, yeah. They talk about moving from a reactive to a proactive approach to taking care of trees.
What does that mean?
So instead of waiting until a tree is sick or dangerous, they're focusing on prevention, regular trimming, checking for pests and diseases, that kind of thing.
Like taking care of your own health, preventing problems before they start?
Exactly. And it's not just the trees themselves, it's about the soil, too. Healthy soil means healthy trees. It's all connected.
It is, yeah. And that interconnectedness, I think, is a big theme in the strategy. They're not just thinking about trees separately. They're thinking about how to make the whole city more sustainable and livable. This deep dive has really shown me how much work goes into planning a city. It's easy to just not think about trees and green spaces, but they're so important.
They really are. And as things like climate change and urbanization become bigger challenges, those trees and green spaces become even more important.
For sure, they help cool down cities, clean the air, and they just make our neighborhoods nicer to be in.
Yeah, and beyond all the practical stuff, there's just something about being around nature that makes you feel better.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, before we finish up, I want to bring us back to that official community plan. We talked about the urban forest strategy, but how does the OCP fit into Kelowna's vision for the future?
Well, the OCP covers a much wider range of topics, but it has that same emphasis on protecting the environment and balancing that with development.
So can you give me like a specific example from the OCP?
Sure. The OCP has policies for protecting environmentally sensitive areas, like those riparian zones we talked about, wetlands, and wildlife corridors. It also supports using green infrastructure and low-impact development practices.
So the OCP and the urban forest strategy are working together to make Kelowna more sustainable.
That's the idea. They provide the guidelines for making decisions that put the community and the environment first for the long term.
It's great that Kelowna's plans are focused on sustainability, but as we've talked about, sometimes there's a gap between the plans and what actually happens.
Mhm.
So what can people do to make sure those plans turn into real changes?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's one we all need to think about. I think the first step is just to stay informed. Read the plans, go to city council meetings, and understand what the issues are.
Knowledge is power, right? Once you know what's going on, then you can get involved.
Exactly. Join a community group, volunteer, and speak up. Let your elected officials know that you care about the environment and that you expect them to prioritize sustainability.
It's about being an active citizen and holding our leaders accountable.
Well said. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by all the challenges, but every little thing we do makes a difference.
This deep dive has been a real journey. We've looked at complicated policies, found some inconsistencies, and talked about some big questions about growth, sustainability, and the future of Kelowna.
But I think it's left me feeling hopeful.
Hopeful because Kelowna is moving in the right direction with their plans and their commitment to a healthy urban forest.
And hopeful because people are engaged and they care about what happens to their city.
This has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for taking us on this deep dive.
It's been my pleasure. And remember, the future of Kelowna isn't set in stone. It's something we create together.
So let's get out there, get informed, get involved, and make our voices heard. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.